When you think about retirement, the picture that usually comes to mind is the same one almost everyone has: some distant day far ahead when you'll finally be able to rest, stop worrying so much, and live a little more calmly. But let me ask you a straight question, the kind that actually bothers you. What if I told you that the way things are today, the biggest risk to your retirement isn't earning too little money, but the way you're living and thinking right now? What if the real danger isn't a lack of investments, but small daily decisions that seem harmless, yet are quietly sabotaging your future without you noticing? Because the drama starts right there. Most people think retirement is a problem for their future self, something that'll get solved later when they earn more, when there's money left over, when life is more organized. But while that later doesn't arrive, time keeps moving, and along with it go opportunities, choices, and habits that don't come back. The villain doesn't burst into your life shouting. It slips in quietly, disguised as normal life, routine, and everyone does it this way. And that's where the danger lives. The first big villain of your retirement today is that constant feeling that you're always financially behind. Not behind on the clock, behind in life. The feeling that every month your money runs out before the month does, that nothing is ever left over, that any long-term plan feels like a luxury that's too far away for someone who's just trying to survive until the next paycheck. That feeling slowly eats away at your mind. It makes you think planning doesn't matter, saving doesn't matter. Thinking about retirement doesn't matter when the present already feels too heavy. And without realizing it, you start treating the future like an unsolvable problem, something so big it's scary to even look at. So you do what the human brain does best to protect itself from pain. You avoid the topic. You change the subject when someone brings it up. You close the video when someone starts talking about retirement. You tell yourself it's still too early even when deep down, time, ice, and Tay on your side. The second villain shows up right after that, walking hand in hand with the first. The illusion that working more years will fix everything. There's a quiet belief, almost never said out loud, that if I have to, I'll just work longer. If I have to. I won't retire. If I have to, I'll figure it out. That gives you a false sense of security right now, because it relieves the pressure to do something in the present. But that idea ignores one simple, cruel fact. Energy, health, and stamina don't stay constant throughout life. You won't have at 60 the same mental and physical strength you have today. And that's not pessimism, it's biology. But the entire system around you pretends that doesn't exist. It pushes you to consume now, get into debt now, live on the edge now, and promises you'll deal with it later. But the future arrives, and it doesn't come with an instruction manual or a guarantee of enough income. Another huge villain, maybe one of the most dangerous, is the normalization of financial struggle. You start to see it as normal to live tired, worried, doing mental math all the time, postponing basic things, using your credit limit as an extension of your paycheck. When that becomes normal, your emotional standard of living drops. You stop noticing how much you're living in survival mode. And someone who lives in survival mode can't think about retirement, because retirement requires long-term vision, and a survival brain only sees to the end of the month. And then something even quieter happens. You start making bad decisions not because you're irresponsible, but because you're exhausted. Tired of thinking, tired of deciding, tired of worrying. So you'll outsource financial decisions to impulse, to habit, to I'll deal with it later. And each one of those little decisions seems insignificant, but added up over the years, they create a massive gap between what you could have built and what you'll actually have later. There's also the villain of false security. It shows up when you trust that something will exist to support you in the future, whether it's the government, a benefit, help from someone, or any structure that seems stable today. The problem is that stability isn't permanent. Rules change, amounts change, living costs rise, and what seems enough today might not be tomorrow. Blindly trusting that is like building your retirement on quicksand. But maybe the cruelest villain of all is silent comparison. You look at other people and think everyone's in the same boat, that nobody is prepared, that everyone will suffer the same. That creates a dangerous comfort, because if everyone is doing poorly, it doesn't feel urgent to change. But the truth is that in the future, that difference shows up brutally. The person who built some kind of structured even, a small one, suffers less. The person who ignored it completely pays a very high emotional price. And the saddest part is that nobody taught you this in a simple way. Nobody sat you down and explained that retirement isn't about getting rich. It isn't about crazy numbers. It isn't about understanding complicated terms. It's about creating mental space today so you don't live in panic tomorrow. It's about reducing future anxiety before it arrives. But because this doesn't get instant likes, because it doesn't sell a quick dream, this subject keeps getting pushed under the rug. Meanwhile, life goes on, bills show up, your body gets tired. Time passes, and the more time passes, the more expensive it becomes to fix what could have been avoided with small changes back then. Not huge changes, not impossible sacrifices, just adjustments in perception, priority, and awareness. But nobody talks about that when you're in the middle of chaos. They only talk when the problem has already turned into an emergency. This is the part where a lot of people stop listening because it hurts. It hurts to realize that the biggest villain in your retirement isn't an external enemy, but a set of habits, beliefs, and fears that were built unintentionally day after day. It hurts because it touches guilt, regret, and the feeling that you should have done something differently. But the truth is, guilt doesn't solve anything. Guilt only paralyzes. What solves is clarity. And clarity begins when you understand what's really happening without romanticizing it, without terror, without empty promises. Up to this point, I've only shown you the surface of the problem. In the next chapters, we're going to go deeper into these villains, understand how they form, why they seem invisible, and most importantly, what you can do even when you feel like it's already too late. So let's keep going, because now is when it starts to make even more sense and maybe even feel a little more uncomfortable, but it does see exactly that. Discomfort that separates the people who keep repeating the same mistakes from the people who, for the first time, start seeing their financial life with more clarity. There's a villain almost nobody notices, because it doesn't show up as a problem, it shows up as a solution. It's the "when I make more money, I'll fix it" villain. That phrase sounds harmless, even logical. After all, who doesn't think that with more money, everything gets easier? The problem is it creates a dangerous mental trap. As long as you believe the problem is simply earning too little, you stop looking at what's truly holding you back today. You go into waiting mode. You wait for the raise, you wait for the promotion, you wait for the next job, you wait for your income to improve. And while you wait, you build no structure at all. Time passes, your income even increases sometimes, but along with it, your expenses increase, your obligations increase, your lifestyle increases, the pressure increases, and retirement stays exactly where it was. Distant, abstract, pushed to later. Not because he irresponsible, but because nobody taught you that financial organization doesn't start when there's money left over. It starts when there isn't. People who only learn to handle money when they earn more usually stay lost, even when they earn more. This villain is cruel because it gives you hope without demanding change. It comforts you today and charges you tomorrow. It makes you believe the problem isn't the system you live in, but only the amount coming in. And that postpones important decisions for years. Years you don't get back. Another silent villain is a total lack of future visualization. When you picture yourself older, what comes to mind? For many people, it's a blur. A vague, distant image, almost like it's someone else. And that's exactly how the brain treats it, as if it were a different person. That's why it's so easy to spend everything now and leave the problem for that other self to deal with later. It's almost like handing a debt to a stranger, but that stranger is you, with the same body, just more tired, with the same mind, just more worried, with less time to fix mistakes. When you create no emotional connection to your future, you sabotage it without feeling guilty, because it doesn't feel real. It doesn't hurt now. It doesn't create urgency now. And then there's another important villain: too much noise, too much information, too much advice, too many people talking about money in completely different ways. One says you have to save everything. Another says you have to live for today. One talks about complicated investing. Another promises fast freedom. In the middle of it all, you freeze. Because when everything feels too complex, the natural reaction is to do nothing. Standing still feels safer than doing something wrong. That information overload creates a dangerous paralysis. You even know you should do something for retirement, but you don't know where to start. And because you don't know, you postpone. And because you postpone, the problem grows. And the bigger the problem seems, the harder it becomes to face it. It's a silent cycle that doesn't explode all at once, but slowly drains your peace. There's also the villain of emotional adaptation. Human beings adapt to almost anything, including discomfort. You adapt to living worried. You adapt to having no clarity. You adapt to pushing decisions down the road. And when you adapt, it stops hurting enough to trigger change. Living financially squeezed becomes normal. Not good, not comfortable, just normal. And when something becomes normal, you stop questioning it. But retirement doesn't respect what you've gotten used to. It arrives whether you've gotten used to living on the edge or not. It doesn't negotiate with your emotional adaptation. And when it arrives, you can't press CTRL-Z. You can't go back and say, now I'll start. The cost of silent adaptation shows up all at once. Maybe the most unfair villain is the feeling of shame. Shame about admitting you're not prepared. Shame about admitting you don't understand. Shame about looking at the numbers and realizing they don't tell a beautiful story. That shame makes you hide. Avoid the subject. Pretend everything's fine. And while you pretend, the problem grows in the dark. People don't talk much about this, but poorly planned retirement doesn't only hurt your wallet. It hurts yourself. It hurts your sense of independence. It hurts the way you see yourself. And for many people, the bigger fear isn't even running out of money, it's depending on others. It's losing autonomy. It's feeling like a burden. But avoiding that fear requires looking at it now, not later. And here comes an important shift in understanding most of these villains don't exist because you did something wrong. They exist because you were pushed into a system that never taught you to think long-term in a simple way. A system that trains you to survive month to month, not to build peace. So before any practical change, something has to happen inside your head. You need to stop treating retirement like a distant event and start seeing it as an emotional process that begins now in the way you deal with money today. It's not about numbers yet. It's not about how much to save. It's not about where to invest. It's about pulling your mind out of survival mode and putting it into at least a minimally strategic mode. As long as you're just putting out fires, there's no retirement possible. There's only accumulated exhaustion. In the next chapters, we're going to start dismantling these villains one by one, showing how small shifts in perception already relieve a huge part of the anxiety, even before any significant amount of money exists. You'll realize the first big gain isn't financial, it's mental. And when the mind leaves panic mode, money starts to behave better. There's a specific moment in almost everyone's financial life when retirement stops being a distant concept and becomes a quiet fear. It's not when someone talks about it. It's not when you see a news report. It's when you feel accumulated exhaustion. When you realize work doesn't excite you like it used to, your body takes longer to respond. Your patience shrinks. And the idea of doing this for another 20 or 30 years starts to feel heavy. And that's the moment many people make a serious mistake. They go into internal panic, but stay externally still. That mismatch between internal fear and external inaction is one of the biggest villains of retirement. You start thinking about the future with anguish, but you don't act because you think anything you do now will be too small to make a difference. Your mind sees it's over, even when it isn't. And when someone believes they've already lost the game, they stop playing. But time keeps running anyway. Another extremely common villain is the idea that retirement is the same as stopping work. That creates a huge mental block because many people can't picture themselves stopped. They can't imagine not producing, not having routine, not having purpose. So the brain associates retirement planning with uselessness, with the end of the line, with forced aging. And to avoid that emotional discomfort, the person avoids the entire topic. But retirement, in practice, isn't stopping. It's choosing. Choosing whether you work or not. Choosing how much you work. Choosing who you work with. But that choice only exists for someone who built some margin beforehand. Whoever doesn't build margin doesn't choose. They just keep going because they have to. And that difference changes everything emotionally. There's also the villain of living on autopilot. You wake up, work, pay bills, solve problems, sleep, repeat. In that mode, there's no mental space to think about the future. Not because you don't want to, but because your energy has already been spent on the present. Retirement becomes just one more worry on a list that's already too full. And when everything feels important, nothing gets real attention. And here's a hard but freeing truth. As long as your financial life depends exclusively on your monthly energy, you will always fear the future. Because energy fluctuates, health fluctuates, the market fluctuates, retirement starts getting built when you start, even slowly, separating your immediate survival from your future peace. Not with big amounts, but with emotional consistency. Another villain almost nobody talks about is the habit of solving everything at the limit. You get used to paying bills on the last day, maxing out the card, negotiating later, pushing problems forward. That creates a constant sense of urgency. And living in urgency all the time destroys any attempt at planning. Retirement requires the opposite of urgency, predictability, and predictability doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from small repeated decisions that reduce chaos. A lot of people believe they can't think about retirement because they earn too little. But in practice, what blocks it most is a lack of clarity. When you don't know exactly where your money is going, the future becomes a threat. Because anything unknown creates fear, and fear makes you avoid, so you prefer not to look, not to track, not to confront. But not looking doesn't eliminate the problem. It only removes your chance to control it. There's also the villain of the belief that planning takes the joy out of life, as if thinking about the future means living a hard life now, without joy, without small rewards. That belief makes you treat any organization as punishment. And nobody sustains something that feels like a sentence. But good planning doesn't take pleasure away, it prevents suffering. It's not meant to deprive you, it's meant to protect you. And here, the narrative starts to shift in tone, because an important point arrives. You don't need to solve your entire retirement right now. That's an unrealistic demand that paralyzes you. What you need is to get out of emotional zero. Stop treating the future like a black hole and start seeing it as something at least somewhat buildable. When that happens, anxiety drops. And when anxiety drops, you can think better. In the next chapters, we'll get into the most transformative part of all. How to create a real sense of safety even before you have a lot of money. How to get out of panic mode without needing miracles. How to build a kind of base that doesn't depend on motivation, but on simple structure. That's where a lot of people feel relief for the first time, because they realize they're not as lost as they thought. So let's move forward, because now we enter the point where many people start feeling something different than fear. They start feeling clarity. And clarity van, when it shows hard truths, relieves more than constant confusion. There's a quiet shift that happens when you understand that retirement doesn't start with money, it starts with emotional control. As long as you associate the future with a threat, any attempt at planning will feel too heavy. The brain reads it as risk, not protection. That's why so many people run from the topic. It's not laziness. It's emotional defense. The big mistake is thinking you first need to fix your entire financial life and only then think about the future. That never happens. Life doesn't magically fall into order and then you plan. Simple planning is what starts putting things in order. And when I say simple, I mean truly simple, no complicated spreadsheets, no crazy calculations, no promises of returns. It's basic structure so your brain stops going into panic. One of the biggest villains of retirement, which only shows up clearly at this stage, is the total absence of margin. Margin is when you're not living at the absolute limit. When any unexpected expense doesn't turn into an emotional catastrophe. And here's something counterintuitive that almost nobody understands. It's not the amount of money that creates margin, it's the habit of setting something aside before spending. Even small amounts, when separated consistently, start changing the way you think. Your brain stops seeing money as something that slips through your fingers and starts seeing it as something that can be contained even if it's little. That changes everything, because retirement isn't about accumulating fast. It's about proving to yourself that you can stop depending 100% on the next month. Another important villain is the idea that security comes from outside, from the job, the company, the government, someone else. That creates a dangerous emotional dependency. When you place your peace in something you don't control, any instability turns into panic. Healthy retirement starts when you build at least part of your security inside your own structure, even if it's small. And here a lot of people freeze because they think, but this is so little, it won't make a difference. But that's your brain sabotaging you again. It compares today's little with tomorrow's unreachable ideal and concludes it isn't worth it. But the reality is that today's little has huge power. It creates continuity, and continuity beats intensity. Always. There's also the villain of motivation. A lot of people think they need to feel motivated to start. They wait for the right day, the right month, for the situation to improve. But motivation is unstable. It comes and goes. Retirement built on motivation doesn't last. What lasts is a system. Something so simple you don't have to decide every time. Something that happens even when you're tired, when you understand that something changes. You stop blaming yourself for not having discipline and start asking why your financial life depends so much on willpower. And the answer is almost always the same. It's lack of structure, not lack of character. Another villain that appears at this stage is fear of getting it wrong, fear of choosing wrong, fear of messing up, fear of losing money. That fear makes you choose nothing, but choosing nothing is also a choice in, usually the worst one, because the cost of inaction is invisible in the short term, but huge in the long term. You don't feel it today, but you feel it later. When you start seeing retirement as a process of reducing future risks and not as a race for money, it feels lighter. It's not about earning more than everyone else. It's about suffering less than you would if you did nothing. And here's a very important point. Retirement isn't a prize for people who get everything right. It's relief for people who make fewer mistakes over time. People who try to be perfect quit. People who accept doing what's possible keep going. In the next chapters, we'll talk about exactly how to turn this clarity into something concrete without becoming a slave to spreadsheets, without difficult language, without empty promises. You'll realize that a lot of what seemed impossible starts to feel manageable when you change the starting point. So we keep going because now we reach a delicate but freeing part. When you begin to realize that the biggest enemy of your retirement isn't lack of money, it's lack of emotional predictability. When financial life is unpredictable, your mind stays on alert. And when your mind stays on alert, anything that isn't urgent feels impossible to do. That's why so many people feel retirement is something for a different kind of person, someone more organized, more disciplined, smarter, but that isn't true. The difference isn't the person, it's the environment they built for themselves. A chaotic financial environment produces chaotic decisions, even in smart, hardworking people. And nobody told you this, but you don't decide badly because you want to. You decide badly because you're reacting all the time. Reacting to bills, to demands, to emergencies, to pressure. Retirement requires the opposite of reaction. It requires response, and you only respond well when you're not suffocating. Another huge villain is confusion between sacrifice and suffering. Many people think thinking about the future means suffering now, giving up everything, living tight on purpose, and the brain rejects that immediately. But retirement doesn't ask for suffering, it asks for direction. Suffering without direction is just wear and tear. Direction without suffering is adjustment. When you understand that, you start seeing that the issue isn't saving money, it's how you live with money. If it comes in and goes out without leaving a trace, without leaving a sense of control, the future will always feel threatening. But when you start creating small points of stability, even imperfect ones, the feeling changes. There's a villain that gets very strong at this stage. All or nothing thinking. Either I do it right or I don't do it. Either I solve retirement completely or I don't start. That thinking is extremely common and extremely destructive because it turns every small attempt into an anticipated failure, and whoever feels like a failure before they start doesn't start. Reality is far less dramatic than your mind imagines. Retirement isn't a straight line. It's full of pauses, adjustments, mistakes, corrections. What destroys you isn't making mistakes, it's stopping. And most people stop not because they can't, but because they demand too much from themselves. Another silent villain is over-worrying about the perfect scenario. But what if everything goes wrong? But what if the rules change? But what if money loses value? These questions sound smart, but many times they're just sophisticated excuses not to act. Because if everything can go wrong, then nothing is worth starting. But the bigger risk has always been doing nothing. And here's a very important point. Retirement isn't about predicting the future. It's about being less vulnerable to it. You don't have to get everything right. You have to reduce the chance of suffering the worst case scenario. And that completely changes the game. When you start thinking that way, something curious happens. Anxiety drops even before any financial result appears. Because your brain understands there's a plan, even if it's simple. And when there's a plan, fear loses power. It doesn't disappear, but it stops being in charge. Another villain that deserves attention is the habit of ignoring your own exhaustion. You get used to being tired, mentally drained, with no energy to think, and you think that's just part of adult life. But that constant exhaustion is a clear sign something is out of balance. Retirement starts when you respect your limits now, not when they've already been crossed. And maybe the most important realization lands here. Nobody builds a peaceful retirement while living permanently at an emotional limit. Before thinking about money, you need to get out of emergency mode. And getting out of emergency mode doesn't require wealth, it requires minimal order. In the next chapters, we'll get into building that order in a practical way, but always connected to the emotional side. You'll understand why small, sustainable changes have more impact than big plans you abandon. And why? Even if you think you started late, there's still a lot of room to reduce future suffering. So let's keep going, because now the conversation starts touching a point many people avoid, but one that completely changes how you see retirement and especially your own value over time. There's a silent lie that follows many people their whole lives. The idea that you'll only deserve peace after you've solved everything, after you've paid all the bills, after you've helped everyone, after you've held on for years, after you've sacrificed enough. Meanwhile, you live at the limit, always delaying rest, always pushing self-care to later, but that later almost never comes. That mindset is one of the biggest villains of retirement, because it makes you believe caring for your future is selfish, that thinking about your older self is taking something away from someone now. And because of that, you always put yourself last. The problem is that when you always put yourself last, time doesn't feel sorry for you. It passes anyway. A lot of people build their entire lives around putting out other people's fires, solving immediate problems, carrying heavy routines, and believing that one day someone will recognize it and pay it back. But retirement doesn't work like that. It doesn't reward emotional effort. It responds to structure, and that's hard to accept because it breaks the idea of fairness many people carry. Another strong villain is confusing hope with planning. Hope is believing things will get better. Planning is creating conditions so that if they don't, you suffer less. Many people live only on hope. They hope their salary will rise, hope the cost of living will drop, hope life will give them a break. And while they hope, they build no real protection. When something goes wrong, the fall is always bigger. Planning, the way it's almost never explained, isn't predicting everything. It's accepting that unexpected things will happen and preparing emotionally for them. Retirement is that, in essence, reducing the impact of the unexpected when you no longer have the same energy you have today. There's also a villain that hurts a lot. The feeling of injustice. I work so hard and I don't get anywhere. That thought piles up over time. It creates anger, discouragement, a quiet sense of failure. And when you feel wronged, you lose the desire to care for the future because it feels like nothing matters. But abandoning your future out of anger at the present is a punishment you inflict on yourself. And nobody teaches you how to deal with that. Nobody teaches you that emotional exhaustion also influences your financial decisions. That when you're frustrated, you tend to spend worse, decide worse, postpone more, not because you irresponsible, but because you burned ouchie. Retirement gets eroded in those small moments of internal giving up. Here's an important truth. You don't have to believe everything will work out. You just have to stop acting like nothing can be done. There's a huge space between blind optimism and silent surrender. That's the space where retirement starts being built realistically. When you begin to step out of that emotional survival mode, something curious happens. You start seeing time differently. The future stops being a terrifying block and becomes a sequence of small, possible steps. And that reduces anxiety. It doesn't eliminate it, but it makes it manageable. Another rarely discussed villain is the fear of looking back someday and regretting it. That fear is so big that many people would rather not think, but ironically, it's exactly that avoidance that increases the chance of regret. Because regret isn't born from not getting everything right, it's born from not trying anything. And here, the narrative starts moving toward a more concrete turning point. Because when you understand all of this, it becomes clear that retirement isn't an isolated financial event. It's the direct result of how you deal with pressure, exhaustion, frustration, and fear today. Change that, and you change the outcome later. In the next chapters, we'll get into the point where many people feel real relief. How to create a sense of progress without needing big amounts. How to get out of inertia without becoming a prisoner of extreme discipline. And how to turn this mental weight into something lighter and more controllable. So let's keep going. Because now we reach a point where a lot starts clicking, not as theory, but as an internal feeling of now I understand why it always felt so hard. There's a quiet moment when someone realizes it wasn't lack of effort. It never was. You always worked hard. You hustled. You tried to make it work. You did what you could with what you had. The problem is that effort without direction doesn't build a future, it only consumes energy. And when the energy runs out, retirement becomes an even bigger fear, because you start wondering how much longer you can keep this pace. That's one of the cruelest villains. A whole life lived in resistance mode, resisting exhaustion, resisting pressure, resisting bills, resisting the feeling of falling behind. People who live resisting don't build. They only survive. And surviving for too long comes with a high cost later. Retirement, deep down, is the attempt to leave resistance mode before it breaks you. Not to stop living, but to live without always being at the edge. But nobody explains it like that. They explain it in numbers, in age, in rules, and then many people disconnect because they don't see themselves in those cold speeches. Another important villain shows up when you become a bit more aware. Emotional immediacy. After years of struggle, any relief becomes an absolute priority. A small comfort, a purchase that brings immediate pleasure, a feeling of reward. And that isn't wrong. What's wrong is when immediate pleasure becomes the only way to compensate for an exhausted life, because then the future always loses. And there's no judgment here. There's understanding. When life is too heavy, the brain looks for relief wherever it can. If there isn't a system that protects the future automatically, it will get sacrificed every time the present screams louder. Retirement doesn't lose the pleasure because you're weak, it loses because you're tired. There's also the villain of silence, that inner voice that says, it won't work. It's too late. With my life, this doesn't happen. This is for a different kind of person. That voice doesn't come out of nowhere. It's built over years of frustration, attempts that didn't work, broken promises, and the more you believe it, the less you act. And the less you act, the more it seems, right? That cycle is devastating for retirement because it kills initiative before it's even born. And the saddest part is that most of the time, it isn't lack of ability, it's too much accumulated disappointment. Here's an important shift. You don't need to fully trust yourself right now. You just need to stop putting yourself in situations where everything depends on willpower. Retirement starts when you take important decisions out of the emotional zone and place them into simple structures. The less you have to decide, the less you'll sabotage yourself. Another villain that hits hard at this stage is lack of continuity. Many people even start something, but stop quickly because they don't see immediate results. And that reinforces the feeling of failure. But retirement doesn't give you quick applause. It gives you slow peace, and whoever expects emotion quits before feeling the real benefit. There's also the fear of facing your own financial reality with no filter, looking and realizing you're not where you wish you were. That time passed faster than you thought. That some choices cost you a lot. That confrontation hurts. And because it hurts, it gets avoided. But avoiding it doesn't change reality, it only delays the impact. When you understand that, you realize retirement doesn't start when you feel confident. It starts when you accept where you are, without drama, without fantasy, without self-punishment. Accepting isn't giving up. Accepting is stopping the fight against reality and starting to work with it. In the next chapters, we'll turn all of this into something more concrete while still respecting the real exhaustion of someone living day-to-day under pressure. You'll see it's not about becoming a different person, it's about adjusting the environment so the future stops being an invisible weight. So now we flip the switch for real not into a cold manual of rules, but into something that finally matches real life for someone who's tired, overloaded, and still has to keep going. The first clear action starts with a simple but powerful change. Stop trying to solve your entire future all at once. Retirement doesn't start when you decide how much you need to save until the end of your life. It starts when you decide that a minimum part of your money can't disappear every month without leaving a trace. The amount doesn't matter right now. The amount isn't the point. The point is creating a psychological boundary. This is not for spending today. When you do that, something changes in your head. Even if it's small, your brain understands that not everything is being consumed by the present, and that feeling, no matter how small, reduces anxiety. You start sleeping a little better, thinking a little better, reacting less impulsively, not because you became disciplined, but because the panic dropped. The second clear action is separating retirement from sacrifice. If every time you think about the future, you feel like you're going to lose joy now, you'll never sustain it. So the adjustment here is emotional. Whatever you set aside for the future cannot hurt. If it hurts, you'll quit. The logic isn't save the most. It's save what doesn't make me go to war with myself. Consistency is born from peace, not force. The third action is stopping reliance on memory and starting reliance on structure. As long as everything depends on you remembering, deciding, choosing, resisting, you'll fail at some point. Not because you can't, but because you're tired. Retirement starts when you create something automatic, even if imperfect. Something that happens without you having to think every time. When money leaves before it becomes temptation, it stops being mental weight. Another fundamental action is reducing the number of daily financial decisions. The more decisions, the more fatigue. The more fatigue, the worse the choice. That applies to small, repeated expenses that seem harmless but drain your mental energy. Simplifying isn't becoming poorer. Simplifying is freeing up space in your head to think about what matters. From this point on, many people feel something new, a light sense of progress. It's not euphoria, it's relief. And that relief is the real fuel of retirement. Because when you feel you're not standing, still even walking, slowly, you keep going. Unlike when you demand too much and abandon everything. Another clear action is separating retirement from age. It isn't something that starts when things work out. It's something that runs alongside life. Even in bad phases, even in difficult months. Because the goal here isn't to grow all the time, it's not to stop. Stopping is what kills the future. Adjusting is what keeps it alive. There's also an important action almost nobody talks about: reducing exposure to unnecessary fear. Excessive comparison, alarmist, news extreme speeches, all of that feeds anxiety and paralyzes you. Retirement doesn't need terror to exist. It needs consistency. The more fear you consume, the less clarity you have. And here's a powerful point. You don't build retirement to be happy in the future. You build it to suffer less. Happiness is subjective. Avoidable suffering is concrete. When you understand that the weight disappears, it's not a distant promise. It's real protection. Over time, these simple actions create something very valuable. Predictability. You start knowing that no matter the chaos of the month, something is being done for your future. And that changes your posture. You negotiate better, spend better, think better. Not because you became someone else, but because you left emergency mode. In the next chapters, we'll go deeper into how to keep this alive over the years, even with ups and downs, even making mistakes, even in difficult phases, and most importantly, how to avoid the most common mistakes that make people abandon everything after a good start. When you start applying these simple actions day to day, something very important happens over time. Retirement stops being an invisible monster and becomes just another part of your life, like paying bills. Working, resting, it loses that exaggerated emotional weight. And when something loses emotional weight, it stops paralyzing you. You start realizing it's not about getting somewhere fast, it's about no longer being completely lost. The feeling shifts from I'm screwed in the future to it's not perfect, but it's moving. And that changes everything. Because someone who feels like they're moving doesn't to quit easily. As the months go by, that simple structure starts protecting you from yourself on the bad days. On days of extreme exhaustion, frustration, and the urge to give up. The system keeps working even when you're not okay. And that's real retirement. It's not depending on your best version, it's surviving your tired version. Another important point that shows up over time is the recovery of financial self. You start trusting yourself a little more. Not because you got rich, but because you stopped completely abandoning yourself. And that trust changes your posture in many areas of life. You negotiate better, accept less unnecessary pressure, make decisions with less fear. All of that comes from this invisible base you began building. You also start understanding something fundamental. Retirement isn't the end of your usefulness, it's the end of absolute obligation. It's the ability to choose to keep going, not the sentence of having to keep going. That difference completely changes how you age, how you work, how you see yourself. And here's a hard but honest truth. Whoever builds no base today, even a small one, pays with anxiety tomorrow. Whoever builds even making mistakes, even slowly, pays with less suffering in the future. There's no perfect scenario, but there is a less cruel scenario. And that alone is a huge win. You will mess up at some point. There'll be a month you can't keep everything. There'll be a difficult phase. That doesn't invalidate anything. What invalidates it is stopping because of shame, guilt, or thinking you lost everything. Retirement isn't that fragile. It only dies when it's completely abandoned. And if you understood everything up to here, one thing becomes clear. The biggest villains of your retirement were never only external. They were always tied to fear, exhaustion, lack of clarity, and living at an emotional limit. When you change that event, without big numbers, you change the outcome. The final goal was never to save a specific amount. The goal was always to arrive in the future with less desperation, less dependence, less regret. To arrive with the feeling that you did what you could, the way you could, with the time you had. That brings peace. And peace has no price. If you made it this far, it means something clicked, that something organized inside your head. And that's already the first sign that you're not as behind as you thought. Now I'm asking you for 3 simple things. If this content helped you in any way, hit like, because that helps this video reach more people who are living this exact same struggle in silence. Subscribe to the channel, because here the conversation is always real, no empty promises, no complicated language, talking about money the way it actually weighs on the lives of everyday people. And if you made it to the end, comment the word clarity down below, just that word. So I know you watched all the way through and that this message made sense to you.